British soldiers were promised a future, but when the war ended, many came home to nothing. No support, no recognition, not even understanding. And this is the part no one talks about. But what Britain actually did was very different. 22 years old, you sign the papers in a drafty recruitment office somewhere in Manchester or Leeds or Glasgow, and the sergeant behind the desk makes it sound simple. Serve your country, do your duty, and when it's over, Britain will look after you. That's the promise. That's the deal. A grateful nation, a pension, a future worth surviving for. So you go, and you survive things that will never fully leave you. The mud of the Somme, the wire at Passchendaele, the particular silence that falls over a trench after a night raid when half the men who went over the top don't come back. Will you survive the gas and the cold and the dysentery and the fear that becomes so constant it stops feeling like fear and just becomes the texture of being alive? You survive. And then, one gray morning, the war ends. The officers shake hands. Someone fires a gun into the air. And you stand there in a field in France or Belgium or somewhere you couldn't have found on a map before 1914, wondering what happens now. This is the story of what happened next, and why the men who fought Britain's wars in the 20th century were, in many ways, betrayed twice. Once by the enemy, and once by the country they bled for. When a young man enlisted in the British Army in the First World War, he was offered a vision of the future worth fighting toward. Recruitment posters promised honor. None officers spoke of duty and sacrifice in the same breath as security and reward. For the men who signed up for regular service, there were pensions, small but real. There were promises of employment assistance, of resettlement, of a state that would stand behind its soldiers when the shooting stopped. The government used the language of obligation. We owe these men, said the politicians. Britain does not forget its heroes. But here's what Britain actually did. For the men who returned from the First World War, and there were nearly 5 million of them, shuffled back into civilian life between 1918 and 1920, the transition was brutal, chaotic, and almost entirely unsupported. The Ministry of Pensions, established to manage veterans' claims, was immediately overwhelmed. By 1921, over 1.5 million men had filed disability claims. The machinery designed to process them was slow, suspicious, and deliberately restrictive. Men were assessed, reassessed, reduced. A pension awarded at one rate was reviewed 6 months later and quietly cut. And then there was the part that no one wanted to talk about. Shell shock, the condition we now recognize as post-traumatic stress disorder, was for years not considered a legitimate disability at all. To receive a war pension for psychological damage, a soldier had to prove that his breakdown had occurred under fire, in the direct presence of enemy action. Men who had collapsed after weeks of sustained artillery bombardment, men who couldn't sleep, couldn't speak, couldn't stop shaking, were told with paperwork that their condition was not the Army's responsibility. It was called constitutional, meaning it was considered a pre-existing weakness of character, not a wound, a flaw. And consider what that meant in practice. A man comes home from the Western Front. His hands won't stop trembling. He startles at sounds that remind him of shellfire, a door slamming, a car backfiring in the street. He can't hold a factory job because concentration deserts him. He can't explain to his wife what he saw because there are no words for it that she could possibly hold. He wasn't wounded, not visibly. So the pension board looks at him, marks him fit for work, and sends him away. He drinks. He disappears into himself. His family watches, helpless, as the man who left comes back wearing the face of someone they no longer quite recognize. The physical casualties were, in some ways, easier for the state to calculate. By the end of the First World War, over 1.7 million British servicemen had been wounded seriously enough to require medical treatment. Thousands had lost limbs. Thousands more had lost eyes, hearing, the use of their hands. The Ministry of Pensions set up a rudimentary system of prosthetics and rehabilitation, and some of it worked. Men learned to write with their left hands, to walk on artificial legs, to live within the narrowed perimeter of what their bodies could still do. But the deeper damage, the damage that didn't show on the outside, was systematically dismissed. A soldier could lose a leg and receive compensation. A soldier could lose his ability to sleep, to trust, to feel anything other than dread, and be told to pull himself together. And this is where it gets worse, because the cruelty was not always individual. It was structural. The War Office, the Ministry of Pensions, the government itself had a financial interest in keeping disability assessments low. Britain had just spent itself nearly to ruin fighting the war. The idea of honoring every promise made to every man who served was, to Treasury officials, an actuarial catastrophe. So the definitions were narrowed. The burdens of proof were raised. Men who could barely function were classified as 20% disabled, 30%, when the honest assessment would have been total incapacitation. The money saved was real. The human cost of saving it was never fully counted. For the men who came home from the Second World War, some things were better. The NHS, established in 1948, meant that at least physical injuries could be treated without the veteran paying out of pocket. The welfare state, for all its imperfections, offered a floor below which men were not supposed to fall. But the psychological story remained largely the same, and this is the part that gets forgotten. Combat stress, combat fatigue, battle exhaustion. The names changed, but the institutional response didn't. Men were expected to return, readjust, and get on with it. The stiff upper lip wasn't merely a cultural cliché, it was government policy. Therapy wasn't available. Talking about what you'd seen wasn't encouraged. Not by the army, not by society, not even really by your own family, who had their own trauma to carry and no language for any of it. A man who had spent years in the Western Desert, or at Anzio, or in the hell of the Pacific Campaign, came home to a country still rationing food, still clearing rubble, still trying to rebuild the ordinary rhythms of peacetime. There was no decompression, no structured transition. You were in uniform on a Thursday and on a bus back to Coventry on a Friday. And the gap between those 2 days, between the man you were in the army and the man your family expected you to be at home, was sometimes unbridgeable. The loneliness of that gap has been documented in letters, in diaries, in the careful testimonies collected by historians decades after the fact. Men describe feeling invisible, feeling that no one around them understood what they had survived or could understand it. The comrades who had been their whole world, the men they'd shared a foxhole with, shared rations with, who had been the only witnesses to the worst things they'd ever seen, were scattered back across the country, living their own separate civilian lives, and often the bond that had felt like the most real thing in the world dissolved quietly in the distance. Some men tried to stay connected to the only life that still made sense to them. The British Legion gave veterans somewhere to go, somewhere their experience was at least acknowledged. Some men re-enlisted, not because they wanted to fight again, but because civilian life had become genuinely incomprehensible. The structure, the purpose, the identity, all of it lived in the military and nowhere else. Coming home had meant becoming a stranger in your own country. And then came what might be the cruelest betrayal of all, the economic one. After the First World War, New Prime Minister David Lloyd George promised soldiers they were returning to a land fit for heroes. What they returned to was mass unemployment, collapsing wages, and a housing shortage severe enough that men who had survived the trenches were sleeping rough in the cities they'd been told they were fighting to protect. The industries that had needed their labor during the war, munitions factories, shipyards, the industrial machine of wartime Britain, no longer needed them. Competition for work was brutal. Men with shattered health, men missing limbs, men who couldn't look an employer in the eye without their hands beginning to shake, were supposed to compete in that market on equal terms with men who had never left. The bonus payments and gratuities issued at demobilization, modest to begin with, disappeared within months. And the promised preferential employment for veterans never materialized in any systematic way. The 1920s ground these men down. Then the Depression finished what the 20s had started. After the Second World War, the story was somewhat different in policy terms, but recognizable in human terms. Demobilization was more organized. The welfare state offered more support. But the psychological damage, the dislocation, the sense of being a returned stranger, that persisted across both generations, largely unaddressed, slowly eating men alive from the inside. And the consequences of this institutional failure weren't only personal, they were political. Veterans who felt abandoned became, in some cases, radicalized. The interwar years saw significant veterans movements, some of them pushing toward fascism, not because these men were inherently extremist, but because the established order had failed them so completely that any alternative seemed worth considering. Men who have been given what they earned are invested in the society that promised it. Men who have been discarded by that society become something else entirely. Britain learned this lesson, but slowly and at great cost. And underneath all of it, beneath the pension disputes and the unemployment figures and the political upheaval, there were just men. Individual men in individual rooms carrying individual weights that no one around them could quite see or name. A man sitting at a kitchen table in Birmingham in 1919, unable to explain to his wife why he can't eat, can't sleep. I can't stop seeing the face of the boy who died next to him in the mud. A man in Leeds in 1946 who drinks every night not because he wants to, but because it is the only thing that quiets what lives behind his eyes. Men whose children grew up knowing a father who was present and absent at the same time, physically in the room, emotionally somewhere no one could follow. These men were not broken by weakness. They were broken by experience, by things that should break any human being and didn't, quite. And so they carried the fracture instead, quietly, for the rest of their lives. The memorials are still standing, the cenotaphs in every town square, the names carved into stone in village churches, in school corridors, in the walls of cathedrals. Britain honored its dead with marble and ceremony and an annual silence. What it did not do, and did not do consistently for decades, was honor its living. The men who came home, the men who survived, the men who brought the war back inside them and tried, for the rest of their lives, to make room for it alongside everything else. Britain remembered its fallen. It put their names on walls. It sent politicians to lay wreaths once a year. But the men who came back, the ones who needed support, continuity, recognition, care, those men were too often left to manage alone, in the silence that follows a war that everyone else is relieved is over. The war ended. The obligation apparently ended with it. And the men who made the victory possible were left to find their own way home, in a country that had moved on before they had a chance to arrive.